I was browsing my YouTube recommendations recently, half just bored and half looking for new design concepts to talk about, when I came across this amazing video from a great new MTG video creator, Blood Artist. In it, they talk about how complexity creep has increased the cognitive load required to play Magic the Gathering, and how various solutions have both alleviated and enabled the mental fatigue problem Magic is facing. Having long been an advocate for simpler units in Fire Emblem, I was inspired by this video to give the topic another stab. While I've talked about how Fire Emblem has drawn complexity away from maps and into units before, it's been a few years since that video, and I feel like I've come up with a concept that can help explain what I mean. Of all the things a game designer has to balance, particularly in an RPG or strategy game, complexity is one of the stranger ones. While there is no set line saying your game must be between X and Y complexity, there does seem to be a middle ground between extremes where most players tend to prefer. If a game is too simple or doesn't ramp up quickly enough, it will often bore players looking for a more intense experience. On the other hand, if a game gets too complex too quickly, it will confuse and frustrate new players into leaving. And while complexity tolerance will build over time, everyone has their own personal limit for when something just gets to be too much. That space between boredom and confusion is what I will call the complexity budget. It is a game designer's job to manage the complexity of all the elements of their game in order to not overwhelm the player while still having engaging and enjoyable moment-to-moment and long-term gameplay. I see complexity as a budget because everything has a level of complexity to it. In Fire Emblem, player units are often considered the most complex things in the game because of the combination of stats, levels, inventory management, movement rate, classes, skills, long-term plans, hidden calculations, and more that units are at the center of. But there are other things that can add to the complexity of a game beyond units. Maps can have many features of their own, terrain types, different objectives, placement of units, whether you are together or split up, turn limits, shops and houses, and even a map's sheer size can add to complexity. Then you have items and weapons with their features. You need to consider strength, weight, durability, whether an item is common to buy, or whether it's a unique or a rare treasure. And this isn't even getting into the UI and UX. If something is hard to understand or isn't shown properly to the player, that might not add complexity inherently, but it does increase the player's mental load and limits how much complexity they can realistically engage with before mental fatigue sets in. Fire Emblem 1 might in many ways be the simplest game in the series, but without a battle forecast, no range viewer, and no in-game way to see what weapons or items do, the amount of complexity a player can reasonably be asked to handle drops significantly, leading to misunderstanding what is happening, making misplays, and often leaving the game out of frustration. The more complexity you put into any one element, the less complexity you will have to spare for other elements. If your map has a lot going for it with side objectives and moving terrain, it'll be harder for a player to keep track of which enemies have particularly dangerous skills. If you have an incredibly large cast of characters, then it actually behooves you to simplify them down to make their strengths and weaknesses more obvious, to thus help players decide who to use in what situation. If you want every single unit to have unique leveling tracks, skills, combat arts, and abilities, like Three Houses does, then limiting the player's units down to a fraction of the game's overall cast, at least without dedicated effort, the way the house system does, is actually a very smart way to cull off a lot of the greater complexity of the game, saving it for later, while still leaving the player with enough room to explore the systems that the game needs them to understand. An easy example to look at is the difference between the Fates games. Birthright undercut its complexity budget, and thus the game ends up boring most dedicated players who are already familiar with the Fates engine. Conquest budgeted its complexity between enemy difficulty, presence of skills, and some map gimmicks and side objectives, and consistently filled its quota without going over, with only a few notable map exceptions. Revelations, on the other hand, budgeted its complexity more heavily in favor of map gimmicks, and compensated for these by broadly having less complex enemies than Conquest. Its larger cast also introduced complexity, so it eased up on the strictness of Conquest's resource restrictions in order to ease the burden of decision paralysis on who a player could train. Its complexity budget was spent well, as can be seen by the amount of appreciation Revelations has gotten recently compared to Birthright. Do you want some more extreme examples? Thracia 776 and Fire Emblem Engage are both very complex games, but their complexity is rooted in very different places. Thracia has complex maps, confusing core mechanics, and a lack of clear information given to the player, but if you understand what's going on, the units themselves are fairly straightforward, with limited stat caps and relatively few skills to consider, and the actions most units can take are limited to core fundamentals: attack, staff, capture, rescue, trade, and wait. The game is fairly high complexity by Fire Emblem standards, but that is all spread out across every aspect, so no one part outweighs the others. Meanwhile, Engage has much more complex decision trees with what your units can do on the map, with how you equip them, with skills and emblems, and the long-term decisions of where to invest your SP, gold, and forging resources. The maps have some level of complexity to them, but objectives are almost always straightforward, and side objectives are either very well flagged or completely non-existent. Weapons get more complex with forging and engraving, but also get less complex with infinite durability and a very rigid rank structure. Outside of some UX issues making some info like weapon stats hard to find at times, the vast majority of Engage's mental load is focused on what you are doing with the units you have on the map, because, with how powerful and game warping the emblems are, how you use each one can drastically transform how a map plays. And, while there are some play patterns that require simply doing math and stacking units together, other play patterns can be incredibly fun and rewarding to pull off, but very mentally taxing to constantly manage. In both cases, the complexity is budgeted, a bit on the high end for the series to be sure, but accounted for nonetheless. Okay, I've put it off as long as I can. Let's finally talk about the game that became the poster child for complexity creep, and see if we can't understand how exactly we got here. It's time to take on
Fire Emblem Heroes!
Good old Faye. I remember playing you on release. The maps all fit on one screen with no scrolling, deployment is limited to 4 player units at a time, units were reduced to colors matching their weapon type, you had 3 easily identifiable slots for skills: a personal buff in A, a situational modifier in B, and a supportive or class type skill in C. And then you had your weapon, your assist skill in green, and a combat special in purple. While the overall formula has not changed that much, they've only really added skill inheritance in an early patch and sacred seals in a later one, and the skills themselves have largely maintained their distinctions in A, B, and C, the sheer complexity ceiling of every single weapon and skill in the game has risen so high over time that even players who have been playing through their entire life of the game have a hard time understanding just what any new skill does without multiple readings. And, while it's not just about sheer word count, my goodness, these things have become novels. At time of writing, one of the newest heroes, T. Veronica, has a weapon description of 175 words, which does not account for the fact that there are at least 3 additional abilities within that word count that need explaining that are only keyworded without reminder text. And that's just her weapon, not including any A, B, C, seal, assist, or special skills. And, with skill inheritance, any individual T. Veronica could have any combination of skills, not just the default ones from the banner. To put this into perspective, the card game Yu-Gi-Oh! Is known for having a borderline abusive amount of text on its tiny cards, with the famed Endymion the Mighty Master of Magic being used as a meme for wordiness and complexity creep. That card's entire text, including both pendulum and monster abilities, is 181 words. Still way too much for a 2x3 by 3.3 inch card whose art and frame take up more than half of the real estate, but it could barely beat out Veronica's weapon. But if this complexity was budgeted for, then where are they making it up for it? The single screen maps definitely help a lot, as do the lack of terrain effects outside the movement hindrance. The chapters are still fairly simple, but it's not like things have gotten more simple over time. I'm not sure how popular other play modes still are, but I remember a decent amount of map complexity coming from things like Aether Raids and Grand Conquests. Fire Emblem Heroes started just about as simple as it could be in every way, and while the vast majority of complexity has been solely isolated to the units, it has gotten to such an extreme that there's very little hope for new players to understand what the heck is going on. But such seems to be the fate of most free-to-play mobile games, at least from what I've heard. But that is all just my version of what I'm calling the complexity budget. I've thought of examples in other games and series too, but I'll leave some room for you all to discuss those in the comments below. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed. And if you really want to and have the cash to spare, consider becoming a channel member, like these lovely people here. Royal Lagoosguard members, The Forgotten L and Minirup, and Lagoosguard tier members L, Enigmatic Mr. L, Mad Moke, Bro Duderman, Kumi, Miss Mesmerism, Drumstep913, Relaz6, Merlinin, and Reely. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, this is Mithril Zenith signing out.